Alright, here we're going to start out Chapter 4, and this section of lecture notes is going to be sections 1 and 2. Overall, Chapter 4 looks at eukaryotic cells and the microorganisms that fall in that large category. So you have these chapter objectives on the first page of Week 4 module. And I'm going to try to include the list of objectives for each section of lecture notes and point directly to the objectives that we're going to cover in that section. So for section 1, it's specifically what is the theory of endosymbiosis, and then section 2, it is comparing or looking at the structures of the eukaryotic cell, and objectives 2, 3, and 4 look over that area or are specific to section 2. The remaining that are grayed out are going to be seen in other sections. Alright, your first section is 4.1, and it says the history of eukaryotes. And this is a picture from a different textbook because your textbook doesn't give you a figure. And this is really describing the evolution of eukaryotic cells. And so what this does is it describes how a large host cell, indicated by this guy right here, and a small bacteria cell or a prokaryotic cell that's been ingested by the big guy, alright, this guy here, how those two entities come to form one entity and become dependent on each other. So the span of this time frame here is incredibly long. From here over here, it could be millions of years, billions of years, whatever your theory is on how life began. And this theory of endosymbiosis is important because it's a theory that simply explains the development of the eukaryotic cell, but also specifically the chloroplast here and the mitochondria here. Now, again, I'm not explaining this to try to be a proponent for evolution, macroevolution, but rather this is simply a good theory to know about with being in a course on biology. Alright, then section 4.2 looks at structures of the eukaryotic cell. And this is figure 4.1, and it looks at all the major structures. Alright, so hopefully you would have seen this somewhere else in your coursework. Some of these look familiar to the prokaryotic cell, but there are key differences. And so here you have the example of the prokaryotic cell. At the grand scale, they kind of look similar, but looking at it on the more detailed scale, there are specific differences. All right, here's a flagellum. Now, in human cells, the only cells that have a flagellum are going to be sperm cells. But when we're talking about protozoan within the eukaryotic realm, a lot of those cells are going to have flagellum. All right. Algae and plant cells are going to have chloroplasts. All right. This organelle right here, it's green to indicate the plant-like nature. And this is where plant and algae are going to convert sunlight and CO2 from the environment into their energy. For the other eukaryotic cells that do not undergo photosynthesis, you have the mitochondria. Mitochondria produce energy. So mitochondria are powerhouses of the cells. We're going to look at these, the definitions of these, in just the next slide and the slide over. All right, but spend a couple minutes and look at the differences between these two cells. All right, I like this picture because it gives you a location within the eukaryotic cells of these different structures. So you have external, which we did this with the prokaryotic cells. External, you have the appendages, so the flagella and then cilia. We also have glycocalyces, right, the capsule and the slime layer. If you remember, bacteria cells do not have cilia, but rather they have fimbriae. So that is important to remember, and it could be a question on an exam. True or false? Bacteria cell have cilia. False. Eukaryotic cells do. And fimbriae are going to be found in the bacteria or prokaryotes. All right, the boundaries of the cell wall, cytoplasmic membrane, very similar to the prokaryotics. And then within the internal component or part of the cell, you have cytoplasm, and then you have the nucleus. In the eukaryotic cells, you have the nucleus, whereas in the prokaryotic cells, you have the nucleoid. And of course, inside the nucleus, you have the chromosomes. You have what's called a nucleolus, and then there is also a nuclear envelope that helps to protect or delineate that region from the rest of the cell. All right, organelles. These are found in eukaryotic cells, but by definition are not found in prokaryotic cells. You have the endoplasmic reticulum, and the endoplasmic reticulum can be by itself or contain ribosomes, and if the ER has ribosomes, then it would be called the rough ER, or RER. And what the endoplasmic reticulum functions as is a place to transport material through the cell. It's a place to store material in the cell. And if it's the rough ER, then the ribosomes on the surface of the endoplasmic reticulum can produce proteins. And those proteins are not put into the cytoplasm, but rather pushed the other direction into the tunnels of the endoplasmic reticulum and able to be stored there for further processing or just simple storage. The Golgi apparatus has a function to process material, right? Whether that is proteins being modified prior to getting to their final place. So it's going to be a series of flattened sacs, so to speak, where proteins will pass through each sequential layer and undergo different processing events. And then you have the mitochondria and chloroplasts, which we talked about on the other side, or on the other slide, previous slide, which again are going to be for the creation of energy. Ribosomes that are free-floating. These free-floating ribosomes are also found in prokaryotic cells, and this is going to be this place or site for protein synthesis. And then the cytoskeleton, depending on the type of cell, will depend on the extent of the cytoskeleton, and there are three major components: microtubules, intermediate filaments, and actin filaments. All right, so specifically look at your objectives as to understand what you need to know about the function of these different components within the cell. All right, then the last slide for this section is just looking at table 4.2, and it's a general comparison of prokaryotic cells to eukaryotic cells, and then also including viruses. And there are different functions or different areas that are different features that can differ between those three groups of entities. Right, it's important to remember that viruses are not considered cells. They're not considered alive. And you can see that by many of these minus signs, meaning it's not present in that group. But all three are going to have nucleic acid, so that's going to be RNA and DNA. Viruses are either one. They're never both RNA and DNA. Right, chromosomes found in both. Eukaryotic cells, generally more extensive in the number of chromosomes and the amount of DNA. True nucleus is found in the eukaryotic cells. Nuclear envelope also just in the eukaryotic cells is going to go along with that true nucleus. Reproduction. Is there mitosis? Yes. Reproduction of sex cells? Yes. And this is going to be kind of a gray area when you look at prokaryotic cells. And then binary fission, is going to occur as the main means of reproduction in prokaryotic cells, but will also happen in some eukaryotic cells. And biosynthesis, all right? Do they have independent biosynthesis? Can they form life on their own? Yes, for prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. No for viruses. So again, viruses are not alive. Is there a Golgi? Is there an endoplasmic reticulum? Yes. Are there ribosomes? Yes. The interesting thing with the ribosomes and what this asterisk is going to indicate is that, yes, bacteria cells, prokaryotic cells do have ribosomes, but they are actually distinct from each other. And so one can target ribosomes with antibiotics as a means of halting protein synthesis and not affect protein synthesis in the eukaryotic cells, because the machinery to make proteins is different between the two groups. All right, respiration is going to occur in the mitochondria for eukaryotic cells, but not the prokaryotic cells. Pigments can be found in both, not always in either. Chloroplasts found in cells that undergo photosynthesis. And then motility, all right, locomotion, structure. Yes, for prokaryotic cells. Yes, for some eukaryotic cells. And again, this is going to be mostly with the protozoa group of eukaryotic cells, sperm cells in humans, and animal cells specifically. Cilia. Are cilia present? Not in prokaryote, because remember, prokaryotic cells have fimbriae. But eukaryotic cells do have cilia, but not all cells are. In the humans, what cells are ciliated? Those found within the respiratory tract. All right, cell wall. Yes, in most bacteria. In eukaryotic cells, plant cells are going to have a cell wall. Some protozoans will, but human cells, animal cells do not. All right, complexity of function. Yes, there is complexity. And viruses are dependent on its host cell. So that is the end for sections 4.1 and 4.2.